Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into the incredible story of a man whose life is pretty much the textbook definition of the ultimate sacrifice for faith. We're talking about the epic transformation of Mus'ab ibn Umayr.
Right off the bat, I want you to just consider the stark, dramatic contrast of this man's life. On one side, you have the absolute most pampered, wealthy youth in all of pre-Islamic Makkah. And on the flip side, a fallen martyr, buried in a torn shroud that wasn't even long enough to cover his body. So how does someone go from having the world literally at his fingertips to dying with absolutely nothing to his name? And more importantly, why would he choose to do that?
Section 1. The Prince of Mecca and a life of unparalleled luxury.
So, Mus'ab was the absolute darling of Meccan high society. He was the only child of his mother, Khunas bint Mak. She was a woman of immense wealth, tons of tribal pride, and she spared absolutely no expense on her son. The sources describe Mus'ab draped in the finest imported Yemeni silks. He wore perfumes that were so rare and so potent that his fragrance would literally announce his arrival in a street before you even saw him. He was the envy of every single noble in the city.
The scale of his privilege is honestly hard to wrap our heads around. To put it into perspective, the sources note that the wealth Mus'ab enjoyed amounted to roughly half the wealth of everyone else in Makkah, combined. Half. The Prophet Muhammad himself actually reflected on Mus'ab's youth with this poignant quote, remembering him as the most pampered youth in the city. His life was flawless, insulated, and perfectly comfortable.
Section 2. Secrets at Dar al-Arqam. The spark of profound transformation.
Well, a rumor starts spreading through the city. And Mus'ab wasn't the kind of guy to just casually listen to whispers about a new message. He was deeply curious. So, under the cover of a quiet night, wrapping himself in a cloak to hide those famous silks, he tiptoes out of his luxurious home and makes his way to Dar al-Arqam. It was right there that he heard the prophet speak. He heard about paradise, hellfire, the reality of the hereafter. He asked questions, and in that very first encounter, his heart just shifted. He secretly embraced Islam.
But man, his fall from societal grace, it happened fast. For a little while, he was living a total double life, a prince by day, a secret seeker by night. But then, a man named Uthman ibn Talha spots Mus'ab doing the Islamic prayer and immediately outed him to his mother. When she found out, her face froze in sheer disbelief. Think about it. This intensely proud woman who had clothed him in silk her whole life actually locked him up and tortured him to break his faith. Ultimately, though, Mus'ab made his choice. He chose a tattered mat over a palace, eventually escaping his imprisonment to migrate to Abyssinia with the other persecuted Muslims.
Section 3. The First Ambassador. Taking the message beyond Makkah.
This brings us to a huge turning point, an assignment that forever changed the trajectory of Islam. During the pilgrimage season, 12 men from Yathrib, the city we now know as Medina, met the Prophet at Aqaba and embraced Islam. Now they desperately needed a teacher to go back with them, and out of all the incredible companions available, who did the Prophet choose? He chose Mus'ab. He gave him the title al-Mukri, the instructor. Mus'ab became the very first ambassador of Islam, taking on this monumental responsibility of da'wah.
You might be wondering, why Mus'ab? Well, it's because he didn't just memorize the verses. He truly absorbed them. He lived them. He had this remarkably calm demeanor. He was incredibly eloquent, and he possessed a deep wisdom. He was polite, gentle, and those specific character traits made him the absolute perfect vessel to bring this massive responsibility to a totally new city.
Section 4. Sowing seeds in Medina. The strategy that won a city.
Upon arriving in Yathrib, Mus'ab didn't just walk into the market and start preaching at random. He had a brilliant strategy. Hosted by Asad ibn Zurara, Mus'ab moved deliberately from neighborhood to neighborhood. He was super careful to avoid head-on tribal conflicts, which were a big deal in Medina at the time. Instead, he targeted influential tribal leaders, using patient, intelligent dialogue and his beautiful recitation of the Qur'an to win their hearts.
If you want to see this method in action, just look at the story of Usayd ibn Huzayr. This fierce tribal leader storms up to Mus'ab, completely furious, brandishing a raised lance, and demands that he stop turning their people away from their ancestral religion. Mus'ab doesn't even flinch. He just calmly looks up and says, "Sit and listen. If you like what you hear, accept it. If you don't, you can reject it." Struck by how utterly fair that was, Usayd literally sticks his lance in the dirt, and by the time Mus'ab finishes reciting the Qur'an, Usayd is asking how to convert. He washes, embraces Islam, and that sets off a domino effect that brings in Saddam and Mu'adh, and eventually the entire Aus tribe.
75. That is the incredible fruit of his labor. Just 1 year later, at the second pledge of Aqaba, 75 Medinans traveled all the way back to Makkah to pledge their allegiance to the Prophet. Because of Mus'ab's tireless strategic work, there wasn't a single house left in Medina where Islam hadn't entered. He had effectively prepared the entire city for the Prophet's arrival.
Section 5. The Battle of Uhud, the ultimate test of devotion.
So now we fast forward past the migration, past the early victories at Badr, to the real climax of his life. And the scene here is deeply solemn. Mus'ab, the same guy who used to wear imported Yemeni silks, is now dressed in simple, patched clothes. On the battlefield of Uhud, the Prophet hands Mus'ab the immense honor and, frankly, the immense danger of bearing the standard flag of Islam for the immigrants.
As we know, the battle turns completely chaotic. The archers leave their posts, the Muslims are routed, and through it all, Mus'ab stands like an absolute brick wall protecting the Prophet. An enemy Ibn Qamiya charges in and severs Mus'ab's right hand with a sword. Without missing a beat, Mus'ab grabs the flag with his left. Then Ibn Qamiya severs the left. Refusing to let the banner of faith fall to the dirt, Mus'ab presses the flagpole against his own chest with the bleeding stumps of his arms, reciting verses of the Qur'an, until he is finally struck down permanently by a spear. His unyielding grip held firm right up until his dying breath.
Section 6. A Martyr's Legacy. The True Costs of Spiritual Wealth.
I want to slow down for a second here because the aftermath of this is just absolutely heartbreaking. The dust settles, the Prophet walks the devastated battlefield, and he finds Mus'ab's body. When the companions tried to shroud him for burial, they realized all he owned in the world was a single small piece of torn cloth. If they pulled it up to cover his head, his feet were totally exposed. If they pulled it down to cover his feet, his head was exposed. Finally, the Prophet instructed them to cover his head with the cloth, and they used sweet-smelling idkhir herbs from the ground to cover his bare feet. The former darling of Makkah left this world with absolutely nothing material.
And this specific sacrifice left a permanent mark on Islamic history. Years later, you'd have wealthy companions like Khabbab ibn al-Arad, who is quoted here, or Abdurrahman ibn Auf, looking at the worldly riches they ended up acquiring, and they would literally weep. They lived in genuine fear that they were receiving their reward early, here in this life. They'd always remember Mus'ab, the man who gave everything and received absolutely none of his reward in this world.
Mus'ab ibn Umayr willingly traded half the wealth of Makkah for an eternal legacy. He transformed from a pampered, insulated youth into the fearless first ambassador of a global faith. And honestly, it forces us to ask ourselves, when it really comes down to it, what are we truly willing to sacrifice for the truth? Think about that as you go about your day. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.